When I was in 5th grade, my family and I lived outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, and I remember a school assignment from that year that completely changed my life. My teacher told us this story of a boy named David O'Dodd who was 17 years old during the time of the Civil War. Now, David was found to allegedly be spying on Union troops who were stationed in Little Rock at that time, and subsequently, he was executed. After his death, David became known as the boy martyr of the Confederacy. So for our assignment, we were instructed to conduct a research project based on this story. We had to then write out the narrative of the story in our own words, draw the illustrations, sew together the pages of the book to form the binding, glue those pages to a hardcover, and then cover the hardcover with the fabric of our choosing. As I began working on this assignment, I couldn't help but notice that something just didn't quite feel right. I had read about the Civil War, and I knew that the Confederate soldiers, in part, were fighting to keep my ancestors enslaved, while the Union soldiers were fighting in part to set them free. So for me to write a story that was honoring the martyr of the Confederacy, it just felt like my identity and my heritage weren't being fully taken into consideration. I felt like I was, in some ways, excluded from being able to fully participate in this assignment. So what I did in response was I used the fabric as my way to enter into this assignment. I chose this fabric that you see here for its colors and designs and shapes and patterns that reminded me of African and African American culture and history. I didn't know it at the time, but this was one of my earliest memories, being faced with an organizational practice that left me feeling on the margins. And I realized that as I continued in school, I wasn't the only student to feel this way. I remember a time during my senior year of high school talking with some friends, and we were discussing that it seemed odd to us that our school wasn't quite doing anything to celebrate the upcoming Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. It was really going to be another day, business as usual. Classes were going to be in session. There weren't any school-wide celebrations or anything like that. So my friend Jamie and I, we decided to take matters into our own hands a little bit, and we talked with our school administrator to see what we could do. And we decided that together we would plan our high school's first ever Black History Month school-wide assembly. And that's exactly what we did. Jamie and I contacted some community organizations, and we invited performers and musicians and singers, and we even invited some African drummers and dancers, all to our high school gym. And we invited all of the students and all of the teachers, and everyone came. And to top it all off, Jamie and I did a poem recitation of Maya Angelou's Still I Rise. And at the end of that school year, Jamie and I were the 2 student winners of our high school's Impact Award. And we were also listed in our local newspaper's 18 under 18 list that recognized the city's brightest and most ambitious young people at the time. I learned from that experience that by collaborating with others and by using my voice, that I could have an impact on an organization, and that impact could then ripple out into the community. Now, I don't share these stories with you to suggest that there's anything inherently wrong with my schools. In fact, I truly loved learning, and my schools really were places that nurtured that. But in this era that we're in society, many organizations, not just schools, but also colleges and universities, businesses and nonprofits, and even communities as a whole, continue to grapple with these questions around race and around diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a chief diversity officer and as someone who has conducted my own research on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I've had a chance to talk with people from all walks of life about these very issues and questions. whether it be a parent who asks me how they should talk with their 3-year-old about race, or whether it be a police officer who asks me how they can be a part of the solution. Perhaps the top question that I get from people is this: how can I advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in my organization and community? And my response to that is through diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, leadership. Now let's break that down just a little bit, shall we? We all know that leadership is very important to organizations, and in fact, research tells us that leadership can play a huge role in things like culture and values, employee motivation, and even organizational performance. And diversity, equity, and inclusion are also very important to organizations. McKinsey & Company, they released a report that detailed the findings of a study. And this study included over 1,000 large companies from around the world. And part of the findings show us that for companies who ranked in the top tier for diversity in terms of gender and ethnicity, these companies also had above average profitability, especially when this diversity was in their executive teams. So putting these together, we get the idea of DEI leadership. Now, I define that as the ability to guide and influence others toward achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And the beauty of it is that anyone can be a DEI leader. Now, there are 3 important components of DEI leadership. And the first one is this: understand your context. Now, this really is about understanding your organization and your community and what's important to it, and then understanding exactly how diversity, equity, and inclusion fits into that, and then spreading that message broadly. Let me give you an example from my research. I conducted a study where I talked to 19 diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders who worked in a higher education context. Now, these were individuals who did things like run DEI workshops or manage programs that supported students from underrepresented and historically marginalized backgrounds, or who did things like serve on DEI task forces and committees. I wanted to understand what their experiences were, what their challenges and successes were, and ultimately, how was it that they were able to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion? One of the administrators that I spoke with, let's call them Jay, told me about their experiences increasing the number of gender-inclusive bathrooms on campus. At first, Jay told me that he wasn't really getting a lot of traction on this particular issue because there were many colleagues on campus who didn't quite understand exactly why this was needed. So what Jay decided to do was talk with some students about how this was affecting their experience. And through those conversations, Jay learned that students were having to travel out of the way to find a restroom that they were comfortable with in between classes. That meant that they left class, walked the opposite direction, and then walked back the other way to get to their next class. And this was a fairly large campus, and so having to do that had a significant impact. It meant that when they got to class, they were frazzled and out of breath and not quite in the best place to learn. So Jay shared this information with his other colleagues, and guess what? Over time, it worked. In Jay's own words, he said, "I made it a student success issue." People responded. So what Jay did was he helped others in his organization understand that by working on this diversity, equity, and inclusion issue, they would be able to also help to advance the overall organizational goals. The second component, if you want to be a DEI leader, is to build meaningful relationships, especially with people who are different from you. Now, this is important for 2 reasons. It helps us with problem finding and problem solving. So when you talk to someone in your organization or your community who has a different experience from you about their experiences in your community or organization, then you really get a much more nuanced understanding of how your organization and community functions. And that also helps you to understand exactly where you need to target your DEI efforts. And on the other hand, with problem solving, as we saw in the story with Jay, many times DEI efforts require collaboration with many people, and sometimes collaborating with people who don't fully understand what diversity, equity, and inclusion is all about. Or maybe they do support DEI, but they may not understand the particulars of that particular issue that you're working on. And so building relationships and having conversations is a great way to provide that education so that they can get on board. Let me give you another example from my research. I talked to another administrator, let's say their name is Ty, and Ty managed a tutoring and academic support program on campus that was housed within the DEI office. Now, Ty ran into some issues where he was getting questions from others on campus who also ran tutoring and academic support centers outside of the DEI office. And they were asking, well, why is it that we need a tutoring center over here when we already have some in other places? So Ty decided to build relationships with them and have conversations and explain to them that students really did need a place to get academic help where they felt fully seen for all of their identities and where they felt they could be very vulnerable. Because when they're most vulnerable, that's when they're able to ask the questions that they really need to be asked. So over time, Ty was able to collaborate with the other colleagues who also ran tutoring centers, and this meant that students had multiple options of where they could go and get academic help, and overall, this led to students having even better grades and better student success outcomes. The third and final component of DEI leadership is maintaining an unwavering sense of hope. Now, many of the DEI leaders that I spoke with, they shared with me that even though there were definitely times where their DEI efforts maybe weren't quite moving as fast as they wanted to, or maybe they experienced some challenges along the way, that they were able to maintain hope by watching the students that they worked with and seeing them flourish on campus and then seeing them graduate and go off and do amazing things once they left. For me, my sense of hope, it comes from reflecting on my own undergraduate experience. At my institution, there was a dynamic administrator by the name of James E. McLeod. Now, Dean McLeod was, in my view, the quintessential example of a DEI leader. And Dean McLeod is sadly no longer with us, but his legacy of knowing everyone by name and by story continues to live on. Now, at my institution, Dean McLeod served as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and as the Vice Chancellor for Students at the same time. And from this prominent position on campus, Dean McLeod saw the need for a special program that served students who were dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who were dedicated to serving their community. I had a chance to be a part of this program all 4 years, and it truly felt like a family. I remember the relationships, I remember the mentorship and the advising, and feeling fulfilled and being able to get academic help, but also social support and all kinds of holistic support. And in reflecting on that, for the first time in my undergraduate experience and in my educational journey as a whole, I no longer had to carve out a space for myself because Dean McLeod and other DEI leaders had done that work for me. So all I had to do was be a college student. And it's that experience that gives me hope today because I know that this is possible and I know what it feels like to be a recipient of that. So as we all think about all the organizations and communities that we're a part of, I invite us to all consider embracing these 3 strategies of DEI leadership. Imagine what it would be like if we all decided to understand our context and to understand exactly how DEI fits into that. Imagine what it would be like if we all decided to get to know people who are different from us. And imagine what it would be like if we all decided to maintain an unwavering sense of hope, even when things get a little bit tough. I believe that if we did that, we would be able to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion from the margins of our organizations and communities to the center. And when we do that, we bring people from the margins of our universities and our institutions and our communities to the center of those things. And when people are at the center and when they feel included, that is when they are best positioned to give their resources and ideas and skills and talents. And those are the things that make our organizations strong. And they also make our communities that much richer. So let's all embrace the idea of DEI leadership and create a better world. We can create a world where not another person has to carve out a space for themselves. And together, we can all rise. Thank you.